The broadcast streamed live to 52 nations as Clint Eastwood stepped onto what many considered the most powerful stage in modern Christianity. Yet none of the 18 million viewers watching from around the world had any idea that the man who once played heroes on screen was about to dismantle the most influential religious empire in America. Not with violence, but with something far more devastating: the truth. A truth that would unravel a cover-up spanning 12 years and challenge everything the Christian world thought it knew about one of its most celebrated figures. Across from him sat T.D.Jakes, radiating the composed authority of a man who had built a $180 million religious empire, counseled presidents, shepherded a congregation of 25,000, and shaped the faith of millions worldwide. Jakes leaned back in his seat with the ease of someone who owned every room he entered. His smile was practiced, perfected over decades under hot television lights. But beneath that polished exterior, his eyes betrayed something else entirely. Calculation, control, the quiet confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. The auditorium held 12,000 pastors, leaders who had traveled from across the nation to attend this conference. They sat in neat rows, notebooks open, ready to absorb wisdom from one of the faith's most prominent voices. The air hummed with anticipation, the kind that comes before something significant is about to happen. Though none of them knew just how significant it would become, Jakes adjusted his microphone, preparing to deliver what he assumed would be another commanding performance. He had done this 1,000 times before. The cameras loved him. The crowds adored him. He was, by every measure the world recognized, a titan. And the man sitting across from him, just an actor, an aging Hollywood relic trying to play prophet. Then came the jab. Sharp, public, deliberate. Sit down. Old actor, Jakes declared, his voice booming through the sound system with the weight of authority and scorn. Let real men of God handle serious matters. The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. 12,000 pastors fell silent. The casual murmur of the crowd died instantly, replaced by an uncomfortable stillness that pressed down on the room like a held breath. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze, uncertain whether they should cut away or lean in closer. It was the kind of insult designed to humiliate, to remind everyone in that auditorium, and everyone watching from home, exactly who held the power here. Jakes had just drawn a line in the sand, and he expected Clint to stay on his side of it. But Clint Eastwood didn't move, not an inch. He sat with the stillness of weathered stone, his expression unreadable. No flash of anger, no defensive posture, just that quiet, unnerving calm that had defined his presence for decades, both on screen and off. His eyes stayed locked on Jakes, not with aggression, but with something far more unsettling. The steady gaze of a man who knew something the other didn't. The seconds stretched. The silence grew heavier. Jakes's smile began to falter at the edges. He had expected a reaction. Embarrassment. Maybe. Submission. Ideally. But Clint gave him nothing. Just that look. The kind of look that made men rethink their choices. When Clint finally spoke, his voice was low, barely more than a murmur. Yet it cut through the massive auditorium with more force than all of Jakes's amplified thunder. Before we start defining what a real man of God is, Bishop, Clint said, each word measured and deliberate, I believe these pastors deserve to hear something. Something about Margaret Sullivan. The name landed like a lightning strike. The effect was immediate and visceral. Jake's face drained of color. The practiced smile vanished as if it had never existed. His eyes widened. Just slightly. But enough. Enough for the cameras to catch it. Enough for the 12,000 pastors to see it. Enough for 18 million viewers around the world to witness the exact moment a man realized his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. 12 years of secrecy. 12 years of cover-ups. Payments. Threats. And silence. All of it trembling now on the edge of exposure. The audience shifted in their seats. They didn't know who Margaret Sullivan was. Not yet. But they recognized the look on Jakes's face. They had seen it before. In their own lives. In their own mirrors. The look of someone caught. The look of someone who thought the past was buried deep enough that it would never surface. Clint let the silence settle for a moment longer. He understood the power of stillness. The weight of a pause. Then he turned slowly toward the cameras. His weathered face filling the screens of millions. There was no performance in his movements. No theatrical gesture. Just the steady presence of a man who had lived long enough to know what mattered and what didn't. "If you believe truth matters more than reputation," he said, his voice carrying that same quiet gravity, "then don't turn away. What you're about to hear reveals the hidden cost of building empires on broken promises and broken lives." He paused, letting the words sink in. The camera held on his face. Every line and crease telling stories of years lived honestly. Mistakes owned. Lessons learned. "This is just the beginning," Clint continued, "and it may be the most important truth modern Christianity has faced in a generation." No one spoke. Not a whisper. Not a cough. Not even the rustle of paper. The silence was absolute. 12,000 pastors sat frozen, their hearts pounding, their minds racing. Somewhere in that vast crowd, people were already reaching for their phones, fingers hovering over record buttons, knowing instinctively that they were witnessing history. T.D.Jakes remained motionless in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. The mighty empire he had spent 35 years constructing, brick by brick, sermon by sermon, suddenly felt fragile as glass. And Clint Eastwood was holding the hammer. But what Jakes didn't realize yet, what nobody in that auditorium fully understood, was that Margaret Sullivan was only the first name on a list. The first thread in a tapestry of deception so vast, so carefully woven, that pulling it would unravel everything. The illusion that spiritual success could be bought and sold. The lie that faith was a transaction rather than a transformation. The carefully maintained fiction that men like Jakes were shepherds rather than predators. The tension in the hall became almost unbearable. Jakes sat frozen, his mind spinning through possibilities, calculations, escape routes. How much did Eastwood know? Who had talked? What proof did he have? The questions cascaded through his thoughts like falling dominoes, each one revealing another vulnerability, another crack in the foundation. Clint remained perfectly still, his presence filling the room not through volume or movement, but through something deeper. The weight of truth, the gravity of justice delayed but no longer denied. He had spent months preparing for this moment, following trails that others had abandoned, listening to voices that powerful men had silenced, gathering evidence that wealthy lawyers had tried to bury. He understood what this meant, understood it in his bones. Millions of people had been misled, manipulated by promises that their money could purchase healing, prosperity, divine favor, that their suffering was proof of insufficient faith rather than the simple reality of human existence. Tonight, that illusion would begin to crumble, and Margaret Sullivan's story was the key that would unlock all the rest. The cameras remained fixed on both men. The contrast was striking. Jakes, once master of every stage he occupied, now looked smaller somehow, diminished. His expensive suit suddenly seemed like a costume, his polished presence revealed as performance. Across from him, Clint sat in simple clothes, his face lined with age and authenticity, embodying a different kind of authority entirely, the kind that couldn't be bought, manufactured, or faked. He turned his gaze back to the lens, speaking directly to the millions watching from homes and churches around the world. His voice remained low, but it carried a weight that made people lean closer to their screens. If you've ever wondered why some preachers live in mansions while their congregations struggle to pay rent, he said, if you've ever questioned why suffering is blamed on lack of faith rather than met with genuine compassion, if you're ready to understand what's really behind the polished walls and television broadcasts of America's mega ministries, then pay attention now. His voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. Every word landed with the force of conviction. Because what Margaret Sullivan experienced, what was done to her, what was hidden about her, that's not an isolated incident. It's a pattern, a system. And it's time that system faced the light. Somewhere in the audience, a pastor whispered to his neighbor. The whisper spread like ripples on water, growing into a low murmur that filled the hall. Jakes heard it. That sound, the sound of his kingdom beginning to crack. Clint watched him for a moment longer, then looked back at the camera one final time. Share this broadcast, he said simply. Because the moment the religious establishment realizes what's being exposed here, they'll try to make it disappear. They'll call it an attack on faith itself. But what's really happening is faith finally defending itself against those who've exploited it for profit. The stage lights seemed brighter now, harsher, exposing every detail with unforgiving clarity. T.D.Jakes sat in that harsh light, aware that the empire he had built, the image he had crafted, the power he had accumulated over 3.5 decades, all of it was now balanced on a knife's edge. And Clint Eastwood held the blade. But the worst part, the thing that sent true fear coursing through Jakes's veins, wasn't just that Eastwood knew about Margaret Sullivan. It was the certainty in his voice. The calm, unshakable certainty of someone who had uncovered not just one secret, but all of them. The offshore accounts, the silenced families, the web of prosperity preachers who protected each other while exploiting the desperate and faithful. If Eastwood knew about Margaret, then he knew about the others too. And there were so many others. The crowd sensed it now. That electric feeling in the air when something irreversible is about to happen. When history is being made in real time, and everyone present knows, they'll remember this moment for the rest of their lives. They leaned forward in their seats. 12,000 witnesses to what would become either the greatest vindication or the greatest scandal modern Christianity had ever seen. And still, Clint Eastwood sat with that same calm expression, weathered and patient, like a man who had learned long ago that truth doesn't need theatrics. It just needs to be told. And once told, it would do its work without anyone's help. Clint let the name hang in the air for several heartbeats. Margaret Sullivan. 2 simple words. Yet they carried the weight of a gravestone. Around the auditorium, phones were already being pulled from pockets, fingers typing frantically into search engines. But they would find nothing. Not yet. The story had been buried too carefully, too deep, protected by lawyers and non-disclosure agreements and the kind of money that made problems disappear. But Clint had found her anyway. Or rather, her daughter had found him. He reached into his jacket pocket, moving with that same deliberate slowness that made every gesture seem significant. What he pulled out was a photograph, slightly worn at the edges, the kind that had been handled many times by someone who loved what it represented. He held it up toward the nearest camera, and the image filled screens around the world. A young woman, mid-20s, dark hair pulled back, eyes bright with the kind of hope that believed the world was fundamentally good. She wore a simple blue dress and stood in front of a small church. Her smile genuine and unguarded. Margaret Sullivan. Before everything went wrong. Margaret was 26 when she walked into Bishop Jakes's ministry. Clint began, his voice carrying that same measured cadence. She had just been diagnosed with stage 3 lymphoma. The doctors gave her options, treatments, survival rates. But Margaret was a woman of faith. Deep faith. The kind that moves mountains. Or so she'd been taught. He lowered the photograph but kept it visible. A physical reminder that this wasn't theoretical. This was a real person. A real life. She'd watched Bishop Jakes on television for years. Heard him preach about miracles. About seed faith. About how God rewards those who step out in trust. So when the medical bills started piling up, when her insurance hit its limits, when she was facing a choice between bankruptcy and treatment, she did what she'd been taught to do. She reached out to the ministry. Jakes had gone very still in his chair. His hands were no longer gripping the armrests. They lay flat now, palms down, as if he were trying to anchor himself to something solid. His face had taken on a waxy quality, and a thin sheen of perspiration had appeared on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Clint continued, his voice never rising, never pushing, just stating facts with the weight of stone. The ministry responded quickly. Very quickly. They always do when they sense opportunity. Within 48 hours, Margaret received a phone call. Not from some volunteer, but from a senior ministry coordinator. She was told that her situation had been brought to Bishop Jakes's personal attention, that he had prayed over her case specifically, that God had revealed to him that Margaret was chosen for a miracle. Someone in the audience gasped. Others shifted uncomfortably. They knew where this was going. They had all heard variations of this story before, whispered in church hallways, dismissed as rumors or misunderstandings. But here it was, being laid out in detail, on international television, by someone who clearly had receipts. But there was a condition, Clint said, and something in his tone made the temperature in the room drop. Margaret was told that to receive her miracle, she needed to demonstrate her faith, real faith, the kind that costs something. She was told that God was testing whether she trusted him enough to sacrifice everything. He paused, letting that sink in. Sacrifice everything. So Margaret did what faith told her to do. She sold her house, a small 2-bedroom home her grandmother had left her. It wasn't much, but it was paid off, safe, hers. She sold it and donated the entire proceeds to the ministry. $93,000. The number echoed through the hall. $93,000. A young woman's entire inheritance. Her only security. Given away on a promise. But that wasn't enough. Clint continued, his voice dropping lower. Because faith, she was told, requires sacrifice beyond comfort. So Margaret borrowed money, $28,000 on credit cards, another $15,000 from a personal loan. She gave it all, every penny, $136,000 in total, transferred into the ministry's accounts over the course of 6 weeks. Jakes's breathing had become audible now, quick and shallow. His hand moved toward the water glass on the table beside him, but stopped halfway, as if even that simple action required too much coordination. And in return, Clint said, Margaret received prayer. She received encouragement. She received assurances that her miracle was coming, that her faith had moved God's heart, that she just needed to hold on a little longer. But what she didn't receive was medical treatment, because the money that could have paid for chemotherapy, for medication, for the doctors who might have saved her life, that money was gone. The silence in the auditorium was no longer uncomfortable. It was suffocating. 12,000 pastors sat frozen, many of them pale, some with hands over their mouths. They were doing the math in their heads, calculating not just the money, but the cost. The real cost. A life exchanged for false hope. Margaret died 8 months later. Clint said, and his voice finally carried something beyond calm recitation. Not anger, not quite. Something deeper. Something that sounded like grief held in check by sheer will. She died in a county hospital charity ward, alone except for her 15-year-old daughter, with medical debt she could never pay and a faith that had been weaponized against her. He looked directly at Jakes now, and the camera caught them both in frame. The contrast was devastating. Clint, weathered but solid, speaking truth that cost him nothing because he had nothing to lose. And Jakes, trapped in his expensive suit, his carefully constructed image crumbling in real time. But the story doesn't end there. Clint continued, because Bishop Jakes did something with Margaret's story. Something that shows just how far the corruption runs. He reached into his pocket again and this time pulled out a different kind of paper. A printed transcript. By the look of it, marked with highlighted sections. 3 months after Margaret died, Bishop Jakes gave a sermon. A powerful sermon, I'm told, about a woman of great faith who had sowed a seed into the ministry. He didn't use her name, called her Sister M, but he told her story, told how she had given everything, held nothing back, trusted God completely. And then he told the congregation that this woman's faith had been so powerful, so pure, that even though she had passed into glory, her seed was still producing fruit. Several pastors in the audience made sounds of recognition. They remembered that sermon. It had been broadcast nationwide. There had been a special offering attached to it. That sermon raised $2.3 million, Clint said, letting the number land like a hammer. $2.3 million. Given by people who believed they were honoring the faith of a woman who had sacrificed everything for God. But what they were actually doing was enriching the same man who had taken everything from her and given nothing back. Jakes tried to speak. His mouth opened, and something came out. But it wasn't words, just a sound. Strangled and desperate. He cleared his throat, tried again, and this time managed to form a sentence. You don't understand the full context, he said, and his voice was rough. Nothing like the smooth preacher's cadence that usually flowed so effortlessly. That woman, she made her own choices. I never forced. No. Clint interrupted, and the single word cut through the hall like a blade. You didn't force her. You just told a desperate, dying woman that God would only heal her if she proved her faith with money. You just positioned yourself as the gatekeeper to divine intervention. You just took her last dime while sitting in your mansion. You didn't force her. You just manipulated her faith to fund your empire. The words hung there, brutal in their simplicity. Around them, the auditorium remained frozen. But something had shifted. The pastors weren't just shocked anymore. Some of them looked angry. Others looked sick. A few looked like they were having revelations about their own ministries, their own teachings, their own compromises. Jakes tried again, stronger this time, reaching for the authority that had always served him so well. This is character assassination. These are accusations without bank records, Clint said calmly, pulling another document from his pocket. I have the bank records. Margaret's deposits into your ministry accounts. I have the timeline showing exactly when each payment was made and what medical treatments she missed because the money was gone. I have emails from your staff discussing her case, talking about how to maximize the opportunity, How to frame her story for future fundraising. He held up the papers. Not theatrically, just factually. Evidence. Proof. The kind that couldn't be preached away or explained with scripture. And I have something else. Clint continued. I have the testimony of your former financial coordinator, a man named Richard Chen, who left your ministry after keeping quiet for 8 years. He's ready to testify about the offshore accounts, about the system you created to route ministry donations through shell corporations, about the other Margaret Sullivans, because she wasn't the first bishop, and she wasn't the last. That's when Jakes's control finally shattered completely. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping backward with a harsh sound that echoed through the microphones. His face had gone from pale to flushed, anger and fear mixing into something ugly. How dare you? He shouted, his voice cracking. You walk in here, some Hollywood actor playing crusader, and you attack a man of God on live television? You have no idea what it takes to run a ministry of this size. The pressures, the responsibilities. I know what it takes to look someone in the eye and tell them the truth, Clint said, his voice still level, still calm. Seems like that's something you've forgotten how to do. Jakes pointed a shaking finger at him. You're destroying lives with these lies. Do you understand that? Destroying faith. Destroying. I'm not destroying anything, Clint said quietly. I'm just turning on the lights. What you built in the darkness. That's what can't survive the exposure. And there it was. The fundamental divide. Jakes, shouting and gesturing and trying to reclaim control through volume and outrage. Clint, sitting still, speaking truth that needed no amplification. The cameras captured it all. The contrast played out on 18 million screens. A man of supposed power revealed as fragile. A man of quiet conviction revealed as unshakable. The audience in the hall began to murmur, then to talk, then in some corners to argue. The broadcast had become something nobody had anticipated. Not a religious conference, but a reckoning. Jakes realized it too. You could see it in his eyes, the moment when he understood that nothing he said would matter now. The truth was out, or enough of it that the rest would follow inevitably. His empire, built on trust and faith and the belief that he spoke for God, was cracking at its foundation. He sat down heavily, his outburst spent, leaving only exhaustion and dread. Clint watched him for a moment, then turned back to the camera. His weathered face filled the screen again. And when he spoke, it was with the weight of someone delivering a verdict that had been delayed far too long. Margaret Sullivan's daughter is alive, he said. Her name is Elizabeth. She goes by Beth. She's 30 now, and she's spent the last 12 years trying to get someone to listen, trying to get justice for her mother, trying to warn others about what happened. Every door was closed to her. Every lawyer too expensive or too afraid. Every reporter too cautious. Every church leader too invested in protecting the system. He paused, and something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile, but something close, something satisfied. But she didn't give up. And when she reached out to me, I listened, because that's what real faith looks like. Not giving up on truth, even when the whole world tries to make you forget. The words settled over the auditorium like ash after a fire. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, as if a dam had broken, everything happened at once. Phones emerged from pockets and purses across the hall. Not just a few, but hundreds, then thousands. The soft glow of screens illuminated faces in the dimmed lighting, and fingers moved frantically across keyboards. Recording, sharing, streaming. Within 60 seconds, clips from the broadcast were spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. Within 5 minutes, The confrontation was trending worldwide. Jakes stood there, still on his feet from his earlier outburst, and seemed to realize that the ground beneath him was no longer solid. His face had gone through several colors now, settling on a grayish pale that made him look 10 years older. He gripped the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "This is slander," he said. But his voice had lost its thunder. It came out thin, reedy, the sound of a man grasping at straws. "Legal action will be taken. My attorneys will." "Will what?" Clint asked. And his tone was almost gentle. Almost. "Sue me for telling the truth? I look forward to that deposition, Bishop. I truly do. Because everything I've said here tonight can be proven in court. Every word. Every number. Every name." He shifted in his seat, that slight movement drawing every eye in the room. "But you know what's interesting? I haven't even gotten to the other names yet. Margaret Sullivan was one story. One woman. But Richard Chen, your former financial coordinator, he has files on 47 others. 47 families who gave everything because they believed you spoke for God." The number hit the room like a physical blow. 47. Not an isolated incident. Not a misunderstanding. A pattern. A system. An operation. Somewhere in the back of the auditorium, a man stood up. He was older, maybe 60, wearing a simple dark suit and a pastor's collar. His voice shook when he spoke, but it carried. "I knew one of them," he said. "James Patterson. From my congregation 5 years ago. He came back from one of Bishop Jakes's conferences talking about seed faith. 3 months later, he'd mortgaged his house to give to the ministry. 6 months after that, he lost everything. I tried to tell him it wasn't biblical, what they were teaching, but he said I didn't understand faith like Bishop Jakes did." The man's voice broke. "James took his own life 2 years ago. Left a note saying he'd failed God, failed to have enough faith. And I've carried that with me every day since, wondering if I could have done more." The silence that followed was profound. Then another person stood. A woman, younger, her hands trembling as she held up her phone. "I'm recording this," she said, "and I'm sending it to every news outlet I can find. Because my sister gave $30,000 to this ministry when her son was sick. $30,000 they didn't have. And when the boy died anyway, they were told it was because they didn't give with a pure heart. They were blamed for their child's death." Her voice strengthened. "I'm done being silent. I'm done watching this happen." Then another person stood. And another. Like dominoes falling. Or perhaps like people standing up for the first time in years. Finding their feet. Finding their voices. They didn't all speak. Some just stood there, bearing witness. Their presence a testimony to something that had been wrong for too long. Jakes looked around the auditorium and saw his world crumbling in real time. These were his peers, his colleagues, leaders in the faith community, and they were turning away from him. Not in anger, but in something worse. Disappointment, recognition, the slow, terrible awareness that they had known, somewhere deep down, that something was wrong, and they had chosen not to look too closely. He tried again, reaching for the persona that had served him so well for 35 years. "Brothers and sisters," he said, and his preacher's cadence was back. That rhythmic rise and fall designed to soothe and persuade. "Don't let this man drive wedges between us. Don't let Hollywood come in here and destroy what we've built. We are under attack. The enemy is using." "Stop." The word came from Clint, and though he didn't raise his voice, it cut through Jakes's sermon like a knife. "Just stop. You're not in your church right now. You can't preach your way out of this. These people aren't your congregation. They're witnesses. And you're not a shepherd. You're just a man who took money from people who trusted you. The contrast was devastating. Jakes, still trying to perform, to manipulate, to control the narrative. Clint, simply stating facts, his weathered face showing no satisfaction in the destruction, just the grim necessity of it. Outside the auditorium, the story was spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated. News vans were already arriving at the convention center, satellite dishes rising like mechanical flowers. Inside the control booth, technicians watched their viewing numbers climb exponentially. 8 million viewers had become 15 million. Then 20 million. Then 25. The broadcast had gone viral in the truest sense. Shared and reshared across platforms. Translated into dozens of languages. Dissected in real time by commentators and pastors and regular people who had always suspected something was wrong with prosperity gospel but never had the evidence. On social media, the hashtags were brutal and immediate. Receipts were being posted. Old sermons were being analyzed. Financial records that whistleblowers had been sitting on for years suddenly found their way into public view. The floodgates had opened, and years of suppressed truth came pouring out. A news anchor in New York interrupted regular programming. We're getting reports of what's being called a historic confrontation at a religious conference in Dallas. Actor and director Clint Eastwood has publicly accused prominent megachurch pastor T.D.Jakes of financial fraud and exploitation. We're going to go live to that feed now. And we must warn viewers that some of what you're about to hear may be disturbing. In living rooms across America, people stopped what they were doing. In churches, in homes, in bars and restaurants with televisions. The broadcast played, and for many viewers, it was the first time they were hearing someone in authority validate what they had felt in their hearts. The discomfort they'd pushed down when they watched preachers in mansions asking for money from people in poverty. Back in the auditorium, Jakes had finally stopped trying to speak. He stood there, swaying slightly, his hands still gripping the table. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a hollowness that was almost painful to witness. He was watching his legacy evaporate in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Clint reached into his jacket one more time and pulled out a flash drive. He held it up, small and unassuming, yet somehow ominous in its simplicity. "This contains copies of everything," he said. "Bank statements, email chains, audio recordings of ministry staff discussing how to target vulnerable people, video footage of lavish spending while donors were told to sacrifice more. It's all here, and copies have already been sent to the FBI, the IRS, and every major news organization in the country." He set the flash drive on the table between them. A small silver object that represented the death of an empire. "You can lawyer up all you want, Bishop. You can deny and deflect and pray for a miracle. But the truth is out now. And unlike the people you took money from, the truth doesn't need your permission to exist." The auditorium had become a storm of activity. Pastors were on their phones, calling their churches, their boards, their own legal advisors. Some were praying. Others were arguing. A few were crying. The neat order of the conference had dissolved into chaos. But it was the chaos of something necessary, something that had been building for years and could no longer be contained. A young man pushed his way to the front of the crowd. He couldn't have been more than 25, wearing jeans and a t-shirt. Clearly not a pastor, but someone who had somehow gotten into the conference. He held up his phone, filming, and his voice cracked when he spoke. "My mom was one of them," he said, and the nearby microphones picked up his words, broadcasting them to millions. "She gave $22,000 to this man's ministry when I was in high school. Money we needed for my college fund, for our mortgage. For everything. She died believing she didn't have enough faith to receive her miracle. And I've spent 7 years angry at her, thinking she was foolish, thinking she threw away our future for nothing. Tears streamed down his face. But she wasn't foolish. She was exploited. And Mr. Died. Eastwood. Sir. Thank you. Thank you for giving her back her dignity. Thank you for letting me be angry at the right person. Clint met the young man's eyes and gave a small nod. No words needed. Just that acknowledgement. One human being seeing another's pain and honoring it. Jakes looked at the young man and seemed to shrink further. Perhaps, for the first time in decades, he was seeing the actual cost of his theology. Not numbers on a spreadsheet or stories to tell from the pulpit, but real people, real families, real destruction. The broadcast continued for another 30 minutes. But the confrontation itself was over. Jake sat down heavily in his chair and stayed there, silent. While around him the world he'd built came apart. Pastors left the auditorium in groups, some supportive of Clint, others still defensive of Jakes, but all of them shaken. The easy certainties of the morning had been replaced by hard questions that would take years to answer. Clint remained seated, calm and still. As chaos swirled around him, he had done what he came to do. The rest would unfold in courtrooms and investigations, in churches and homes, in conversations between people of faith trying to reconcile what they'd believed with what they now knew. As the crowd began to thin, a woman made her way to the front. She was in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that held both grief and steel. She walked with purpose, and when she reached the stage, she climbed the steps without hesitation. Beth Sullivan stood before the cameras, before the millions watching, and before the man who had taken everything from her mother. She didn't speak to Jakes. She spoke to the camera, to the world. "My name is Elizabeth Sullivan," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Margaret Sullivan was my mother, and for 12 years, I've tried to tell this story. For 12 years, I've been ignored, dismissed, threatened with lawsuits, told to move on and forgive. But today, someone listened. Today, someone believed me. Today, the truth finally matters more than protecting powerful men." She turned then and looked at Jakes directly. "You took my mother from me, not just her life, but her last months, her peace, her dignity. You took everything, and you used her story to take from others. But you don't get to do that anymore. We're taking our stories back. All of us." The camera held on her face, fierce and tearful and unbowed. And in that moment, millions of viewers saw not just a victim, but a survivor who had become a warrior. The days following the broadcast moved with the inevitability of justice too long delayed. What had started as a confrontation in a Dallas auditorium became a national reckoning that rippled through every level of American religious and legal systems. Within 48 hours, federal agents arrived at the ministry headquarters. They came early, before dawn, with warrants and boxes, and the kind of quiet efficiency that spoke of cases built carefully over months. Because the truth was, they had been watching for years, waiting for something, anything, that would give them the legal foundation to move. Clint's broadcast had provided exactly that. Public testimony, documented evidence, and most importantly, victims willing to go on record. The FBI's white-collar crime division took the lead, focusing on wire fraud and money laundering. The patterns they found were extensive and damning. Ministry funds flowing through shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, then returning as personal income disguised as book royalties and speaking fees. Donations earmarked for mission work ending up in real estate portfolios. The financial architecture was sophisticated, built by expensive accountants who knew exactly how to walk the line between aggressive tax strategy and outright fraud. But Clint's evidence, combined with Richard Chen's testimony, showed they had crossed that line repeatedly and deliberately. The IRS moved more slowly, as they always did, but with equal determination. Tax-exempt status required certain standards, certain accountabilities. The ministry's filings told one story. The bank records told another. And the gap between those two narratives represented millions of dollars that had never been properly reported, never been taxed, never been used for the charitable purposes claimed. Beth Sullivan became the face of the victims, not by seeking it, but because her story, her mother's story, embodied everything that had gone wrong. She was articulate, credible, and most importantly, unwilling to be silenced anymore. Within a week of the broadcast, she had appeared on 3 major news networks, each time speaking with the same calm determination that had marked her statement in the auditorium. "This isn't about attacking faith," she said on one program, sitting across from a sympathetic host. "This is about protecting it. Real faith doesn't demand your rent money. Real faith doesn't promise miracles in exchange for direct deposits. And real shepherds don't build mansions on the backs of people living in poverty." The host, a veteran journalist who had covered religious scandals before, leaned forward. "What do you want to see happen now?" Beth didn't hesitate. "Accountability, legal accountability, financial accountability, and systemic change. I want laws that require transparency from large religious organizations. I want oversight that protects vulnerable people. And I want every person who gave money to this ministry based on false promises to have a chance at restitution." She got her wish, though not quickly and not easily. A class action lawsuit formed within 2 weeks, representing over 300 families. The legal team worked pro bono, motivated partly by the high-profile nature of the case and partly by simple outrage at what had been done. They filed in federal court, alleging fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and violation of consumer protection laws. Jakes's attorneys fought back hard. They claimed religious freedom protections, argued that donations were voluntary, insisted that the government had no business regulating matters of faith. It was a strategy that had worked before for other ministries, a legal shield that had protected questionable practices for decades. But this time, the evidence was too strong and the public attention too intense. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The courthouse steps became a daily gathering place for supporters and protesters. News, cameras, and prayer circles. Inside, the proceedings were meticulous and damning. Witnesses testified about pressure tactics used to extract donations. Accountants explained the money trails. Richard Chen spent 3 full days on the stand, walking the jury through internal documents that showed calculated exploitation. The most powerful testimony came from the victims themselves. They sat in the witness box, one after another, and told stories that were variations on the same theme. Desperation met with promises, faith weaponized for profit, lives ruined while someone else grew wealthy. A woman in her 60s described giving $80,000, her entire retirement savings, after being told at a ministry conference that God had revealed she was blocking her own miracle through fear. She lived now with her daughter, working part-time at a grocery store to contribute to household expenses. A young father explained how he had taken out a second mortgage on his home to donate $50,000 when his daughter was diagnosed with leukemia. The ministry had assured him it was a seed that would produce healing. His daughter died anyway. He lost the house in foreclosure 2 years later. A veteran described being told that his PTSD was a spiritual problem, that more faith and more giving would solve. He had donated his disability benefits for 8 months before attempting suicide. He survived, but barely, and now worked to warn other veterans about predatory religious practices. The stories accumulated like stones, building a monument to suffering that no amount of legal maneuvering could dismiss. Clint attended the trial several times, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom. He didn't testify. His recorded statement from the broadcast was submitted as evidence instead. But his presence mattered. Reporters asked him questions on the courthouse steps, and his answers were characteristically brief. "Justice doesn't belong to me," he said once, squinting in the afternoon sun. "It belongs to those people in there. I just helped turn on the lights." Another time, a reporter asked if he felt responsible for destroying a ministry that had helped many people. Clint looked at the reporter for a long moment before answering. If it was built on lies and exploitation, it needed destroying. Real faith doesn't fear the truth. Only corruption does. During the trial's 4th week, Clint sat down for a longer interview with a respected news program. The interviewer was thoughtful, asking questions that got to the heart of the matter rather than seeking sound bites. "How can regular people protect themselves from this kind of exploitation?" the interviewer asked. Clint shifted in his chair, taking his time before responding. "Same way you protect yourself from any con. Ask questions. Real organizations don't mind transparency. If a preacher tells you God wants your money but won't show you where it goes, walk away. If someone promises miracles based on the size of your donation, that's not faith. That's fraud. But isn't there a place for prosperity teaching in Christianity? There's a difference between believing God cares about your well-being and being told you can purchase blessings like they're items in a store." Clint said, "Real shepherds don't drive Bentleys while their flock goes hungry. They don't live in compounds while their congregation struggles with rent. Common sense applies to faith just like everything else." The interviewer pressed further. "What would you say to people who still believe in T.D.Jakes? Who see this as an attack on their faith?" Clint's expression softened slightly. "I'd say, I understand. When you've put your trust in someone, invested your faith, maybe your money, it's hard to accept you were deceived. But staying deceived doesn't honor God. It honors the person who lied to you. Real faith is strong enough to survive the truth." The interview became one of the most watched segments of the year, shared millions of times, discussed in churches and living rooms across the country. It provided a framework for conversations that had been needed for years, a way to question corrupt practices without questioning faith itself. Beth, meanwhile, had channeled her energy into something concrete. She established the Margaret Sullivan Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping victims of religious financial fraud. The foundation provided free legal assistance, connected people with financial counseling, and most importantly, gave victims a place to tell their stories without shame or judgment. The response was overwhelming. Within 3 months, the foundation had received over 2,000 requests for help. Stories came from every state, every denomination, every demographic. The problem, it turned out, was far larger than anyone had realized. Margaret Sullivan's story wasn't unique. It was emblematic. Beth worked 18-hour days, driven by a mission that went beyond personal justice. She spoke at churches, appeared on panels, wrote articles about recognizing and resisting manipulation. Her message was consistent. Faith should empower, not exploit. God doesn't need your last dollar. And anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. She also worked with legislators, pushing for laws that would require financial transparency from large religious organizations. It was an uphill battle. Religious freedom protections made many lawmakers hesitant. But slowly, Progress was made. Several states began considering bills that would require churches with revenues over $10 million to file public financial reports, similar to other nonprofits. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on 14 counts of wire fraud, 5 counts of money laundering, and 8 counts of tax evasion. The courtroom erupted, some people weeping, others embracing, still others sitting in stunned silence as the reality settled in. Jakes showed no reaction. He sat at the defense table, hands folded, face blank, as if he had already left his body and what remained was just a shell going through the motions. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. The judge, a woman in her 60s with a reputation for fairness and no patience for corruption, addressed the courtroom with careful deliberation. Mr. Jakes, you held a position of immense trust. People looked to you for spiritual guidance, for hope, for connection with the divine. Instead, you exploited their faith for personal enrichment. You took money from people who could not afford to give it, made promises you never intended to keep, and then used their suffering as marketing material to extract more donations from others. She paused, letting the words land. The harm you've caused is extensive and will ripple through generations. Families destroyed, trust shattered, faith itself called into question because of your actions. The sentence was 8 years in federal prison. Additionally, Jakes was ordered to pay $45 million in restitution to victims, a sum calculated based on documented fraudulent donations. His assets were to be liquidated, the ministry dissolved, and remaining funds distributed to those who had been defrauded. It was, by any measure, a complete fall, from megachurch bishop to federal prisoner, from advisor to presidents to convicted felon. The man who had commanded stages and influenced millions would spend the next years in a cell, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about what happens when power goes unchecked. As Jakes was led away, Beth stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by other victims who had become her allies, her friends, her chosen family forged in shared experience and shared purpose. Reporters clustered around, cameras rolling, microphones extended. "How do you feel?" someone called out. Beth considered the question. Relieved. She said finally, "This doesn't bring my mother back. It doesn't erase the years of pain. But it means she mattered. Her story mattered. And maybe, just maybe, fewer people will suffer the way she did." "What's next for you?" "The work continues," Beth said simply. "There are still hundreds of families waiting for help. There are still systems that need changing. Justice for one man isn't enough. We need justice built into the system so this can't happen again." The ranch sat on 40 acres of California hillside, far enough from the city that the nights were quiet and the stars were visible. Clint had owned it for years, a place to return to when the world got too loud, when the business of Hollywood or the noise of public life needed to be left behind. He returned there now, not in retreat, but in completion. The work was done. The rest would unfold without him, as it should. The days settled into a rhythm he had known before and welcomed again. Mornings began with coffee on the porch, watching the light change over the hills. Then came the work, simple and necessary: mending fence lines, feeding the horses, tasks that required attention but not thought, leaving his mind free to wander or rest as it chose. There were no cameras here, no reporters. The phone rang occasionally, but he let most calls go to voicemail. The people who mattered knew where to find him, and they knew he would respond when he was ready. 3 months after the sentencing, a letter arrived. The handwriting on the envelope was careful. the kind that suggested someone had taken their time, wanted to get it right. He recognized it before he even opened it. Beth's letter was 2 pages, handwritten on simple paper. She thanked him, though she said she knew thanks were inadequate for what he had done. She told him about the foundation's work, the families they had helped, the lives slowly being rebuilt. Over 400 cases now, she wrote. 400 families who had found justice, or at least a path toward it. She told him about the legislative victories, small but significant. 3 states had passed transparency laws for large religious organizations. 2 more had bills pending. It was slow work, she wrote, but it was happening, and she told him about herself, how she had found purpose in the pain, meaning in the mission, how her mother's story had become a catalyst for change rather than just a tragedy, how she had learned that healing didn't mean forgetting, but rather transforming grief into something that could help others. At the bottom of the 2nd page, she had written, "You showed me that one person speaking truth could change everything. Now I'm trying to do the same. Not for glory, just because it's right." Clint read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and set it on the table. He sat for a while, watching the afternoon light slant through the window, thinking about the strange paths life took, the unexpected ways people's stories intersected. He had not set out to become anyone's hero, had not wanted the attention or the praise that had come after the broadcast. He had simply seen an injustice, had the means to address it, and did. The way he figured. That was not heroism. That was just being human. But Beth's letter reminded him that sometimes being human was enough. Sometimes speaking up when silence was easier. Standing when sitting was safer. That was all it took to change a life, to shift a system, to turn a tragedy into something that meant something. The foundation had become more than he had imagined. Beth had built it into a national organization, with offices in 5 cities and a network of volunteer attorneys spanning 30 states. They provided legal aid, financial counseling, and perhaps most importantly, a community for people who had been isolated by shame and manipulation. The legislative changes were happening too, slowly but steadily. Religious organizations with annual revenues over $10 million now faced increased scrutiny in several states. Transparency requirements, independent audits, reporting structures that made it harder to hide fraud behind faith. It was not perfect. The laws had loopholes, and enforcement would take time. But it was movement. It was acknowledgement that the problem existed and needed addressing. Sometimes that was how change happened. Not in revolutions, but in incremental steps that added up over years. Clint spent his days working the ranch, his evenings reading on the porch. He thought sometimes about Margaret Sullivan, about the quiet courage it took to seek help when you were desperate, the trust required to believe someone when they promised hope. He thought about how that trust had been betrayed, weaponized, turned into profit. And he thought about Beth, carrying that weight for 12 years, refusing to let her mother's story disappear into silence. That kind of persistence, that kind of strength, that was real faith, not the transactional kind that prosperity preachers sold, but the kind that kept moving forward even when the world said to give up. One morning, 6 months after the trial, Clint stood on his porch as dawn broke over the hills. The air was cool, the sky shifting from dark to gold. He held a cup of coffee, still warm in his hands, and watched the light spread across the land. He thought about the young man at the courthouse, the one who had cried while thanking him for giving his mother her dignity back, about the woman who had lost her retirement, about the father who had lost his home, about all the people whose faith had been used against them, whose hope had been monetized. They were not statistics anymore. not numbers in a case file. They were people reclaiming their stories, their voices, their right to believe without being exploited. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied. Clint set down his coffee and walked down the porch steps, his boots crunching on gravel. He crossed the yard to the stable, where morning chores waited. Simple work, honest work, the kind that reminded you what mattered. Later, after the horses were fed and the morning had fully arrived, he saddled his oldest mare and rode out across the property. The hills rolled away in every direction, golden grass moving in the breeze. The sky was wide and clear. He rode for an hour, not going anywhere in particular, just moving through the landscape, being present in the moment. No cameras, no scripts, no performance. Just a man on a horse under an open sky. When he returned to the ranch house, he unsaddled the mare and brushed her down, taking his time, being thorough. These rituals mattered. The care you gave to what depended on you, the attention you paid to responsibilities that no one else would see or praise. As the sun climbed higher, Clint stood in the stable doorway and looked out across his land. He thought about justice and faith, about corruption and courage, about how sometimes the hardest thing was just to speak truth when everyone around you had agreed to look away. He thought about Beth's words in her letter. Not for glory, just because it's right. That was it, really. The whole thing distilled down to its essence. Some fights were worth having not because they would make you famous or wealthy or powerful, but simply because they were right. Because silence in the face of wrong was its own kind of wrong. Real faith, he had learned, was not about prosperity or miracles or transactional relationships with the divine. It was about integrity, about treating people with dignity, about building communities that lifted rather than exploited, that served rather than consumed. The truth did not need an audience. It did not need applause or validation. It just needed to be told. And once told, it did its work. Slowly, sometimes. Imperfectly often. But inevitably, Clint walked back to the house as the morning settled into midday. There would be lunch soon, then more chores, then evening, then sleep. The rhythm would continue. Day after day, season after season. No spotlight, no stage, just life, lived honestly, in a place where the work mattered more than the recognition. And somewhere, in cities and towns across the country, people were rebuilding, families were healing, laws were changing, systems were being held accountable. Not because of him, not really, but because people like Beth had found their voices and refused to be silenced again. That was enough. More than enough. That was everything. The sun climbed higher, painting the hills in light and shadow. A new day, like all the others and unlike any before. And Clint Eastwood, who had spent a lifetime playing heroes, had learned that the real heroism was quieter than anyone expected. It was just doing what needed doing, saying what needed saying, and then stepping back to let justice do its work. The world would keep turning, the noise would fade, and maybe, just maybe, fewer people would mistake polished stages for sacred truth, would look past the performance to see what real faith required. Not your money, just your integrity. Not your worship, just your humanity. The rest, as it turned out, took care of itself.